Mic check 1 2. Testing 1 2.
Assalamu alaikum. For everybody who's in the masjid, inshallah, we're going to begin, and anyone online, we're a few minutes late. We have a hard stop. 11:30 is the absolute maximum we can stay today, inshallah. But we will go ahead and start. Brother Ahmed, you can recite Quran for us. This will go on our YouTube video.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين.
Jazakallah khair. Thank you to those who are here and to anyone who's tuning in online as well. We know it's the beginning of the summer and it's Memorial Day weekend and maybe not terribly convenient for everyone, but it's hard to find convenient weekends in May to do these things. So, alhamdulillah, what we really, we had this conversation starting yesterday. We've had several others in the past sort of talking about the need for renovating and expanding the masjid and getting community input. We have a survey that Brother Muhammad has put up. We have about 70 responses so far. So we appreciate getting everyone's feedback and input. So there's twofold, the intention behind these events is twofold. One is to get community input, but also just to keep people informed about what's going on in the process so that people feel like they've had the opportunity to sort of be informed of the process. I think you'll see from what Brother Muhammad presents today, and Allah Jazil Khair, because he's been putting a lot of work into this, you'll see that it's complicated, it's not really easy, and I think you'll see a little bit about why we're telling folks, right now we're not necessarily picking out the layout for the interior of the masjid. We're trying to find out what we are even permitted to do. And so you'll see in the presentation today that Brother Muhammad has had some conversations, extensive conversations with folks within the city about what we can do on the lots that we currently have. One of the challenges of our location is that there's a lot of zoning restrictions and things like that we have to keep in mind. But alhamdulillah, there's a lot of khair and benefit in the locations that we're at, that we really are trying to take as much advantage of as possible, but of course doing so within the bounds of what is permitted. And so we will go through some of that. We'll review sort of what's been done so far, what our next big decisions are, and then sort of what what your all's thoughts are on that. We will be monitoring comments on the YouTube live stream, so if anybody is tuning in there and would like to ask questions or provide comments, we will be reviewing and monitoring that during the program as well. The other thing I want to just tell folks is, we're trying to get in a lot of these meetings right now because it is such a complicated process that any kind of delay is really going to, delay things long term because we have to get so many preliminary approvals and things like that. But at the same time, we're not, we don't have a plan for what the inside of the masjid looks like. This is all going to be a long-term process. So if anybody, I know a lot of folks have come up to me and said, well, I heard the masjid is going to look like this, or the women's side is going to be like that. And what I've been telling people is anyone who tells you that the masjid is going to look like this doesn't know what's going on, because we're not at the point of having any sort of final decision made about what the interior of the masjid is going to look like, especially, or even the exterior right now. So it's a process still. We're still trying to decide. The shura ultimately takes into consideration what folks, the feedback that we're getting from folks, of course, what our experts recommend to us, and what we feel as representatives of the community is also in the best interests of the community as well, and not just the current community, but in the long term. So with all those things in mind, we ultimately come up with a final decision about the steps to proceed forward. And sometimes we come up with a decision and find out that doesn't work, and we have to backtrack and say, okay, we're going to fix something else. So again, it's a process. We make dua that Allah puts khair and barakah and guides us to decisions that are for the good of the community, and ask you guys to continuously please make dua for us and forgive us for all of our mistakes, because I'm sure we have made and will continue to make plenty, but know that we do it with good intentions, and hope that Allah guides us to what's best. Now, with that said, I'm going to invite Brother Muhammad Abbas to come present what's been going on, what's been happening, and what we still need to figure out. And again, Brother Muhammad has put in a ton of work into this process, and we really appreciate that. I will also remind folks, even though it's not a big crowd in the masjid now, that anybody who wants to speak, when we do comments and things, that please use the microphone, because if you don't use the microphone, you cannot hear online what's being said. So please try to use the microphone if you're going to speak, inshallah. So, jazakumullah khair.
Jazakumullah khair. Thank you, Sister Maha. Assalamu alaikum. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So to start, thank you, Sister Maha, for that great introduction. That was a very good explanation, basically, of what today is going to be like. So without further ado, we'll get started. As a reminder, if there's any sisters in the building that would like to come to this side, we have a divider here to allow for privacy, so feel free to come on over. So why are we here, right? We're here to discuss kind of the final or near final scenario review. So right now we've met with the city, and as you can see on the timeline that we've shared, we've had that first input meeting in the scenario review discussion, and this is the second meeting for the scenario review discussion to consider alternatives and preliminary massing options, and we're going to go over some of those with you today and kind of the situation around those decisions. After that, so there's a clear step here that we're going to move on to, inshallah, after this meeting. There will be a decision made as far as the draft plan massing by the shura, and then that will take us into different scenarios as far as the interior layout, exterior massing, exterior layout, etc. But there's a decision that's going to be made after this meeting and after some consideration, and that will help jolt us forward into the next step. So we've discussed, several operational challenges of the current building, and I'm not going to dwell on this because I talked about this a lot last meeting, but just as a reminder, obviously space has been a concern, functionality of the current spaces, comfort and privacy, representation of Islam in our community and our Muslim community, as well as building code concerns, and there's many more, and there's a Google Doc that you guys can access through the survey that has all those challenges as well as those that have been brought up since that survey has been completed for public access. So to start, I want to give you guys an update on the public input survey results first. So last meeting we had about 43 respondents, so you can see that we've almost doubled, mashallah, our respondents to the survey just from last meeting. So that proves that the meetings are working, the information is getting out there, and people are providing their input. So the age range is still very similar from 76 to 16. There's a lot of great feedback. So just to give you guys an idea of what the feedback is and what responses we've received so far. So on the question of what building size would you prefer, the largest response was actually 41.4% for a new building across the street, and then the second next response was for a 3-story jumbo, which would vertically and horizontally expand from this building, and that that's still unknown, but you're going to get a lot more information today on what actual other options there are as well. So we'll talk about that. What's most important to you? Sustaining current building operations, 20%, maximizing increasing current space, 80%. So that was a clear answer there. What's most important to you? Larger musalla areas or more multipurpose and flex spaces? That was about almost 50-50, 45.7% more multipurpose spaces and 54% larger musalla areas. What's most important to you? Women's area having direct visual access to the imam, or the women's area being secluded visually but with video and TV to the imam. So out of 70 responses, this was exactly 50-50, which I found baffling. But that's a clear answer. Obviously, that the community is split on that. So that is something that we will take into consideration. Maybe there's a way of doing both, and there's a lot of architecturally good ways to do that. Additionally, what's more important to you? Having an exterior space for the children to play is that blue one, 24.3%. Exterior congregation space within the extents of the building footprint, 24%. So that was half of the people were split on whether exterior should be mostly congregation or mostly down children playground. And then the other half of that basically said that maximization of interior space with minimal exterior space would be preferred. If the 2-story were to become the selected option, what's more important to you? In blue, which was the majority, 47%, women on their own floor upstairs with a balcony to the floor below, which is one of those options of what I had mentioned before, being able to handle both. Women on the same floor as the men downstairs with the multipurpose room spaces on the second floor potentially, or women multipurpose spaces on the first floor were 12.9. So a lot of good feedback there. And then the last two things. So this one is really important question to us. That's that bar graph there. What's the optimal occupancy size of the masjid in your opinion? So from 100 to 1,000, the majority said 500 would be the optimal space. You're going to see today there are some limitations that are imposed on us due to the zoning and parking, and that will help dictate that. But luckily, we're fall right very close to that 500 mark based on those limitations. So that should be good. And then, can we count on you to donate on this project? Mashallah, 87% of the people said yes. So that's great news. And then last question I'll talk about from the survey. So when asked about the lot across the street, what to do with it, 44.3% said to build a multi-unit residential building with a parking structure and maintain some type of waqf. And then 34.3% said to convert it to a well-lit parking lot. 11.4% said to build the masjid there and use the current building as the multi-purpose space. And then there were many other ideas. So this was a fill-in question if you remember. So there were some responses regarding a multicultural center, a Halal retail store center, and then multi-purpose hall potentially. So a lot of good feedback, and we're definitely taking all this feedback into account. And then obviously at the public input session, so we've heard a lot of public input and feedback, so such as sustainability and energy efficiency being a priority, like water bottle fillers in lieu of all the plastic water bottles that we use, solar panels or other options to reduce operational expenses, limiting the musalla uses for prayer and atikaf only, and allowing there to be other spaces in the building for other uses. Outdoor playground for kids and space for pre-adolescents, so 9 to 12-year-old youth, in order to accommodate for a peaceful musalla area, and accommodation for the elderly using cushioned seating, ergonomic furniture, instead of the hard furniture that we have currently. And then also accommodations for 2073, not just 2023, so 50 years ahead. Privacy for the sisters, but also access to the minbar visually. Iftar logistics should be taken into consideration, and an operational plan for this within the design. So a lot of great feedback we're getting from this public input session. So we do invite you guys to provide as much feedback as you can, whether during the event, after the event, to me, to any of the board members, and we will compile that information. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about the zoning and kind of all the things that have happened so far. So this is a basically overall plan of what the zoning looks like from above in this region based on the map. So the Masjid, if you're not familiar with maps as much, the top right corner there where it says RN5 across from CG2. So you can see my mouse, which you can't, but the top right corner of that cluster there, where the red corner across the street from the orange corner, can you see it now? Yeah, below where it says right of way, or ROW, in that corner there. So that corner there is where the Masjid is. So CG2 is the current zoning for the Masjid, and across the street is RN5. So RN5 is a residential zoning for multifamily, and CG2 is a commercial general district zoning. So that's going to be important in a few minutes. But basically, overall, that's what the plan looks like right now. In order to change anything on this plan, which is dictated by the city, there's a process called a rezoning. And a rezoning is a process where you meet with the City of Knoxville Planning Commission and City Council, and basically request a area to be a different type of zoning based on what it is that they would like, what it is that we would like. So in this case, anytime you submit for a rezoning, the primary document that the city officials and the planning officials use to consider rezoning is called a sector plan. Sector plan is revisited every 5 years, and that basically is created based on what the 10-year plan is for the region. And the sector plan for this region calls for MUCC16, which is just a designation, which you can pull up in the code, and you can see I took a snippet there on the right. But it basically says recommended uses are appropriate for the entire district as follows. The existing office, wholesale, warehouse distribution, and retail along Grand Avenue should be allowed to continue on those sites as a standalone use or as a mix with other uses. The design and scale of the building should be complementary to the surrounding neighborhood. And then it lists high density residential, medium density residential, and then along Grand Avenue, which applies to us, office, business park type 2, and neighborhood mixed use commercial. So that's one of the things that they look at when they're considering a change as far as a rezoning. So to further along that, within the rezoning options, there are limitations which will guide the form of the building. So if you remember last meeting, I mentioned that function typically follows form, or form follows function. It really depends on the case. In this case, the form will dictate the function, because the size of the project, the size of the building, the shape of the building will be dictated based on what we can put in it. So parking limitations on this project are extremely important, and I'm going to go through why that is. In order for us to build a project as a place of worship, there's a special code that applies to places of worship. And within certain zoning, so within the current zoning that we have for this property, CG2, it allows a place of worship under a special use approval. Special use approval, which you say in front of the planning commission, you say, hi, I'd like to make a place of worship in this area. They consider it, and then they either approve it or deny it. Across the street, the RN5 zoning does not allow for a place of worship except under special use approval and a potential rezoning. So there are considerations there that have to be made to dictate that. And then in our case, a place of worship size is typically limited by the size of the main prayer area. So when they want to find out how many people you can fit in the building, they're considering only the size of the main prayer area. Obviously, that doesn't eliminate the requirements to meet certain egress and ingress rules and sizes for entrances and exits and stuff like that, but that's a major benefit to us, especially when building a mixed-use type building, because that allows you to make a prayer area the size that you have, that you're limited to by the parking that you have, and then allow for additional spaces that could potentially be used as multi-purpose or whatever. And then on event days and stuff, you can extend them to do those other things that you need to do them with. And then on like Joma or on Eid or large prayer events, you can use those areas for prayer as well. So the parking across the street, right? Figuring out, all right, what can we do with across the street if we take putting a building there and set it aside for a second and think about the existing property. Can we build a parking lot? Can we build a parking structure? What are the limitations associated with that? Because parking dictates the size of the building. So without building a building on it and building just a parking structure, cost-wise, it costs about between $45,000 to $65,000 per space of a parking building. So if it's above ground, a parking structure will cost about $45,000 per space. Below, and then the spaces that go below ground cost a little bit more money because they have additional limitations as far as digging and other work that has to happen. So if you break that down, and based on the city code, we're allowed 4 people per parking space. So that basically gives you a per person cost of what a parking structure would cost. So $11,200 or $15,000, depending on whether it's above ground or below ground. Keeping that in mind, limiting the parking across the street, if you were to build a parking lot instead of a parking structure, which would be the least cost that could be implied, the limitations of a parking lot based on the required green spaces and the walking spaces and the stuff that has to go in a parking lot in the city of Knoxville, you'd be allowed 80 to 90 spaces. So say you took the majority of that 90 spaces, that gives you approximately 360 people. So that limits your occupancy of the main assembly areas in the masjid to 360 people. That 360 people, based on the square footage sizes that they allow 7 square feet per person. So if you take 360, multiply it by 7, you should get, if my math is right, 2,520 square feet of assembly space. So that would obviously have to be split between the men's and the women's musalla. And that essentially dictates the size of the musalla that you'd be allowed to use. Which, in our case, that's not much bigger than the space we have currently. But there are a lot of things that can be done to extend that, right? So there's a reduced exclusion that we can request, and that exclusion changes the calculation from 4 spaces per person. It reduces it by 20%. So we would allow 432 people, which would bring us up to 3,024 square feet of assembly space. So looking at it from the perspective of the limitations of parking, there's a lot that can be done in addition to the space that we would have in the assembly space. So you can, make a multi-purpose space behind each of the musalla areas and use them as other uses, and then on event days or something, you end up using them maybe there's a way to open them up or whatever. Architecturally, there's a lot of solutions. But essentially, big picture, that's a very big limitation that we would need to be aware of. So, obviously, there's an intent to spend money the right way. It's an amena. We want to make sure we're spending it the right way. And that's why I wanted to make sure that it's clear to everybody the costs associated with a parking structure versus a parking lot. Architecturally, as I said before, you can keep spaces outside of the formal assembly space, and that allows you to do different things. So taking that into consideration and having that knowledge, we should be able to go to the zoning options and talk through what are the limitations from a size perspective. So the current zoning of the masjid on this property is CG2, as I mentioned before. The property of the masjid, the zoning of the property across the street, currently being RN5, it can be rezoned to CG2. RN5 would not allow you to build a place of worship. It would allow you to build like a building, and then part of it can be a place of worship, but you wouldn't be able to build a standalone place of worship. However, there's other things that can be done. So if we rezoned, basically we looked at about 8 or 9 different options, all of the options that the city of Knoxville gave us, and they dictated to us, here's all the different zonings that we would even entertain, and that list was basically 2. In addition to those 2, there were several others that are possible, and several that we brought up, several that they brought up. However, based on a lot of things, so if we go back real quick to the map, you can see the other zonings in this area. The way that they consider rezoning, in addition to looking at the sector plan that I mentioned before, they also look at the other zoning that's there. So, for example, you have IMU, which is industrial mixed use, all those pink boxes to the left. You have a lot of RN5 and a lot of RN6. You have some office space, and then you have there's a hillside protection zone, which is just an added layer of stuff that we'd have to go through. And then there's institutional, which is that blue in the bottom left corner. So if it's not on the sector plan, but it is nearby, you could make a case to try to rezone it to one of those rezonings. Obviously, I think the easiest one would be agricultural to rezone to, if, like, from a building perspective, but there isn't any agricultural here and it's not in the sector plan. So there's really no reason, for example, in that case, for them to accept an agricultural rezoning. So there's limitations to what you can ask for because it has to make sense. Otherwise, they won't even consider it at the meeting and you'll just be rejected. So kind of taking that back and going into the different options. So if we were to rezone to CG2, the lot across the street, we would have a good reason to do so because the building here is CG2 already, and it's currently being used within the CG2 limitations, and it's owned by the same people. So there's a lot of good reasons, other than it, even though it's not, explicitly written into the sector plan that commercial general use is allowed as CG2, it does allow for mixed use. So the argument could be made that the rezoning of the property across the street should be mixed use. CG2. So if you have the building, the property across the street as CG2, the benefits of doing that is it permits a parking structure. It also permits a standalone parking lot. A lot of the zoning, RN5 included, does not allow a parking lot to be put in by itself. It has to be part of a building or part of a use, whether you build a park or you build something. You have to build something in order to have parking, and that parking has to associate itself with that space. And there's other things that we kind of talked about with them to see what their temperature was on it. Like, what if we built a small structure and we called it a place of worship and we made it part of the campus here? Could we then build a massive parking lot that meets both uses? They consider that shared parking. So the term shared parking is defined in the code, and it's only allowed under certain zonings. CG2 does allow it, so shared parking is possible, and that also allows you to to share that parking with other uses as well. So say, for example, during times that the masjid is not being used, if you wanted to allow that parking to be sold to others for other things or for events or whatever, you could use it in that case. Places of worship are permitted under CG2 as well. And the process is an application for rezoning to the Planning Commission. And then the Planning Commission has to recommend the approval. The Planning Commission will recommend the approval, and then it goes to a City Council meeting. And City Council then has to approve it. So as far as a rezoning, the Planning Commission is not the only party responsible for approving that. So, all right, well, if the property across the street can be CG2, what are the limitations to that size property? And those limitations also apply to this property. So I couldn't get them both on the same sheet, but you're going to see the maximum size allowed within CG2 for both the property across the street and this property. So on the property across the street, in this case, you have a rear setback, which is 0. So you're allowed to maximize the rear of the property all the way to the edge of the property line. Side setback is also 0. So you can build to the full extent of that property, and the height limitation is 70 feet. And that's the same for this existing building size. So 70 feet, if you think about a 10-foot ceiling height, that could be up to 7 stories. So, there's a pretty large limitation there, which is good. We were originally, thinking between the 1 to 2 story range, but based on the zoning alone, there's a lot of ability to do other things. Within that height limitation, so that height restriction does not include any arrays or decorations. So you can, for example, if you wanted to put in a minaret and then a spire or something along those lines, those would not be limited to that building height. So if you were to get to the 70-foot building height and then you wanted to build a minaret or something on top of it, that can be done without having to worry about those limitations. But as I said, the property line restrictions are very minimal within CG2. So this is the most favorable for obviously the masjid to be extended in this manner. Now, there's a lot of things that have to be discussed, right? So within a rezoning, in order for you to rezone an area, typically you have to provide a site plan of what you intend on building. And that site plan has to be reviewed and approved by the neighboring residential districts. So in this case, the historic Fort Sanders neighborhood, which is just to the south of this area, would have to agree to it, as well as the city councilman of this area. So it's not required, but it's definitely recommended and suggested that happens. So that will be one of the action items that happens before we go to rezoning or before we attempt a rezoning, if that's the suggested or approved decision, to go in front of those two bodies or those two people and get their support for the project. So that's also another thing that has to happen. And then so I said earlier there was 2 rezoning options really that are, quote, realistic or have a decent potential. The lesser of the 2 options, the second, is to go to IMU, which is the one I mentioned before, is industrial mixed use for the property across the street. And the things that are allowed within that are a place of worship is not permitted. So you would not be able to get a special use approval for a place of worship. However, a standalone parking structure is permitted, a standalone parking lot is permitted, and shared parking is possible. So both of these 2 options allow, both CG2 and IMU allow for a parking lot, a parking structure, and shared parking. So now really the next question is, or the next piece of the discussion would be, well, what is the best size structure, right? So there's a lot of different options or things that can be done in order to minimize costs, but also increase space. So for example, if you were to build a 5-story building or a 7-story building or a 2-story building, however size building you wanted to, but had a limited budget, for example, in this case, if the budget number is what it is, then you can not fit out certain spaces up higher in the building or lower in the building and keep them unfit out. So, for example, you just build, sheetrock walls, or just keep them, actually, if they're above occupied spaces, all you need is sprinklers. You don't even have to put sheetrock walls up. And you could just leave them unfit out and basically blank, right? And then have that structure be there so that in the future, if an expansion or something wanted to be discussed, you can easily do that and fit out the interior space without having to worry about the interruptions to the current operations and really a whole lot of approvals, because the city in that case won't have anything to say from a neighborhood perspective. At that point, all they really can say is, you can fit out the space, and they'll review the drawings for ingress and egress and approvals from that manner. So there's a large benefit, obviously, to trying to maximize the structure when thinking, that 50 years ahead that we discussed earlier, without having to worry about the budget from that perspective, because you can maybe limit the amount that you build. So that's pretty much the discussions that have been had. That's pretty much the meeting that we had with the city. That was what was discussed, from a big picture. Right now what's happening is the board is obviously considering this, and we wanted to make sure that I wanted to make sure that everybody here was heard, and a lot of discussion can be had, and then we can easily go through any of your thoughts and get some feedback and go from there, and that can be taken into discussion. So I think Sister Matt has something to say, and I'll pass it off to her.
So sometimes it helps when someone knows a lot about a subject. It can be harder to follow. I think that Mashallah, you did a really great job summarizing that. I know very little about construction, but have had the benefit of Brother Hamid explaining this to me now 2 or 3 times. So just to make sure, so I want to make sure everyone has an opportunity to ask questions, because it can be complicated. But I'm going to sort of explain to you what I understand, and then Brother Hamid, correct me if I'm wrong. So in terms of what we actually build, sort of use, dimension, size-wise, we're limited by 2 primary things. One is the zoning of the property, and 2 is the parking, because you're required to have a certain amount of parking for the occupancy of the building. And so we were looking at, if we want to build, looking at both pieces of property, we're not just looking at this, we're looking at both pieces of property. If we want to maximize the use of both pieces of property, what are our options? And so what you saw were drawings that were done by our architect, DIA, to show us sort of, okay, if we're able to get it rezoned. Right now, the property across the street cannot be used for anything but residential residences, and residences with parking, if you want to do that. So we're currently using it informally as a parking lot, which we've done for many years, because that's what our needs have been. So we need to get that rezoned to use it in any way, under any sort of circumstance, other than if somebody wants to build a huge apartment complex right now and put a parking garage on it. Okay, so we know we need to do rezoning there. We don't have to rezone the property that we're on now, because it's fine, the zoning that we're at now for this property. So that was sort of what we're looking at. And so if we are able, so what are our options for sort of rezoning the parking across the lot across the street so that it can be used for in furtherance of the masjid? And so that was sort of, I think, what those pictures were showing you. And then the drawings. So I think it was nice to sort of see, okay, here's what a building the size that's allowed under the current zoning would look like sitting on that property. So just to give you an idea. So that's kind of where we're at in terms of deciding sort of our next steps will be, just confirming what we want to do with the property across the street, what direction we want to go in terms of having it rezoned, and then what size building that we would ultimately try to get approval for, with the idea in mind that potentially you can have a building as bigger than what we currently need, but leave it unfinished, parts of it unfinished, so that it can be ready in 50 years for someone to finish it out if the needs of the community demand such. Is that a good summary? All right. And so now I think we're opened.
So that was a great summary. I do. So people are starting to send a lot of questions in. So I'm going to read through them, and I'll kind of sprinkle them in between. The first one I received, because it actually is really important, before we start, I forgot to mention this. So The question is, do these limitations apply if we are just renovating and updating the inside without expanding? So that's a great question, and it's really important to understand. So as long as you touch or modify more than 50% of the overall layout or program of the existing building, there's three things that have to happen. Number one, you have to submit, obviously, to the city for a permit and get that permit approved. And in addition to doing that, you are required to meet all the current codes. So in order to meet the current codes, obviously, there's a lot of things that are not here that would need to be done. So the sprinklers would have to be installed, which is a large cost. And there's a lot of things that would have to happen. So as long as anything is happening to the masjid that covers more than 50% of the building, and actually, if you read into the rule, it could also be considered that if within the past 10 years more than 50% of the building has or will be modified from the original permitted use, you would need to bring it up to code. So technically, all of the past renovations that have been done would be taken into account for that calculation. Whether or not that actually happens in real life, that has not really been an issue or has been something that come up, but the answer is yes, essentially. The limitations do apply if you're just renovating and updating the inside without expanding, or if you do just a small expansion of the structure.
That question then, so if we need to get permitted, then we're not going to get an occupancy permit if we don't have the parking situation figured out. The parking will still need to be done if we do any substantial renovation without expanding the footprint of the masjid.
So for the benefit of those online as well. So whether the parking is across the street or somewhere else, you need to dictate to the city and to the planning commission when they approve your permit how you intend on providing the required the items that are required in the code. So parking, etc. All the things that are required. So whether you use the lot across the street to do that or some other method, whether you bus people in from another area, you have to provide some level of an operations plan, and they have to believe it and believe in it, etc. So it looks like we have a question. Brother Ashraf, do you mind passing that mic? It's right next to you. Well, for the people that are on Zoom, there's like 20-something people on here, so it would be helpful.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Thank you for that very informative presentation. I have two questions. One, how are we anticipating any issues from the city allowing us to rezone? How is rezoning going? And two, we're totally out of code in the masjid, correct? So it's like if we're gonna do stuff, we may as well go big or go home, right? Because anything we do is gonna require, we're gonna have to come up to code.
Thank you for that question. So the first question, I forgot it. Oh, okay. Right, so the zoning. So we have not started any of the rezoning process yet. Essentially, when you go into rezoning, a few things have to happen. I tried to mention earlier. So the city councilman has to support your project because essentially the rezoning will go in front of city council, and it's customary that all the city councilmen on the board typically vote with the councilman that is in charge of that area, because that person has had the most feedback and responses and discussions with the neighborhood, with the people. He's the person that gets he or she is the person that gets the grief when there's grief, right? So we have not started that process. We have not even started the discussions yet with those people yet, because when you have the discussions, they want to know what your plan is, and right now we don't know what our plan is. So that's the first. The second is the neighboring districts. So here we're lucky, we only have one neighboring district, so that could be a blessing and a curse. So the blessing side of it is you only have one person to negotiate and deal with. The curse side of it is that if they don't support your decision, there's not other districts that you can say, well, they're okay with it, but this is the one person that's not okay with it. The benefit here is that we've been here for a long time. The use is not changing. Essentially, the number of people that come here are already the number of people that come here. So it's not like there's really anything that's going on, and the history of this property does not have a history of complaints. So, you can look easily and look into the system and see there has not been any complaints really about anything other than very small little intermediary things that have mostly been unfounded or have been corrected immediately. What was? Oh, okay. So the second question about code. So there are no current violations on the property that we currently have. Now, knowing that there are a lot of limitations to a building when you occupy it with a certain number of people, and you have to have a certain amount of egress, etc. I haven't personally done that analysis, and I don't plan to because I don't want to know the answer. But there are a lot of changes that would need to happen if somebody were to go down that route. So we're good for now. But yeah, anytime you change anything, it will need to you'll have a lot to do. Any other questions? I think somebody over here or Ahmed.
Isn't the 1 year plan anyways for the lot across the street is to become mixed use, so it shouldn't be that bad rezoning?
So the 1 year plan for across the street is MUCC 16. Actually, I think I have it here. 1 second. So this is the 1 year plan. So you can see that whole area in pink on the north side there along Grand Avenue is MU-CC 16. And that is defined by this little snippet here. So it says high density residential, medium density residential, and then office, business park type 2, and neighborhood mixed use commercial. So yes, neighborhood mixed use commercial, CG2 would fall under neighborhood mixed use commercial. So that's correct. Which is why CG2 would be a relatively easy rezoning, I think.
And then how much is the estimate for a paved lot? I think all you gave was the structure.
Yeah, so I didn't have good numbers on that, which is why I didn't do it yet. But I'm working on it right now. I've already actually sent it out to get just a rough estimate. So hopefully I'll have that by the next meeting, and for the board.
So that actually was my first question: is the cost of the just parking, surface parking. But ballpark figure, do we expect it to be? I mean, you said 45,000 to 65,000 for above ground or underground structure. So do we expect that to be, I don't know, 20,000, 10,000 per spot, something like that? What's
Sure. So typically, based on an asphalt parking lot and not knowing what is required to add in, but ballpark round, you can expect somewhere between 10 to 15,000, maybe as far as 20,000, depending on what gets added per space, based on only just asphalt, not having to do a whole lot of grading, not having to do a whole lot of adjustment. Here, in order to maximize the parking, the lot currently, it has a little bit of a slope before it actually gets to the parking space. That's valuable square footage there. So if we can do a lot of that grading, build some retaining walls, bring all of that out and use the full maximum amount of the space, that's how you get to 90. Right now we only have 71 spaces, I counted this morning, and that's including the spaces that aren't marked that park along the side there in order for you to get past during Jummah. So, to get to that 90 spaces, a lot of work has to be done. So, somewhere between 10 and 25,000 per space, I guess. It just depends on what else has to happen. And that's why I wasn't really comfortable putting a number in here, because there's so many different things that can adjust that.
Right. So my second question, in terms of height, are there any restrictions on vertical height for the current building under the current zoning that we have to adhere to? So you said 3, 5, 7 stories building. Not that we would go for it, but can we actually do it if we wanted to?
Yeah, so I might have forgot to mention it before, but under CG2, which is the current zoning, 70 feet is the maximum building height. So what happens is the first 45 feet, you can go all the way out to the edge of the property line, and then you have to have 2 feet back for every foot that you go up. So essentially you'd have 45 feet up, and then you do like a 10-foot setback or something for some level of terrace, and then you can go up the rest of that 30 feet to get to your 70 feet. But at the end of the day, the maximum building height has to be 70 feet.
So this translates into how many floors?
So, here it depends on the size of the ceiling. So here you have like a 15-foot ceiling height, so it would be maybe 5 or 6, but
not all floors. Not
right.
every,
Right, you're gonna make up for some of it. Right. So somewhere between 6 and 7, I think.
Okay. So it's not so we're not limited by that, I guess, for even 3 or 4 stories, that's not going to be a limitation.
Yeah, and that was a big benefit that we learned at that meeting when we had with the city.
Right. So a related question, in terms of building and not finishing, so we still have to put the physical structure all the way to the top and then maybe keep 1 or more floors unfinished. Is that a realistic assessment?
Yeah, that's correct.
How much saving does that give us in terms of cost if we just build a structure and just put sheet walls around it? Is it like 50% of the cost for those extra floors, or more or less?
So the answer to your question depends on 2 things. Typically, when if you don't mind turning your mic or like, so that way there's no feedback. Okay, so typically there's first when you build a building, if you're building a structure already, a brand new structure, adding 1 or 2 floors, the cost is minimal because you're already mobilizing to the area. All you're doing is paying for the extra material and extra labor to go up. But you're not paying for the majority of the costs, which are bringing all the heavy equipment there, bringing all of the labor there, and demobilizing them, and setting up the site and unsetting it up, etc. So if you're already building, it's the cost to expand that building or to extend that building at that same time is minimal. Typically, it's like overall on the cost of a project, 30% or 40% of the cost is the structure typically. The second is if you're building a building and then demobilizing everybody and then coming back 5, 10, 15 years later and then adding to that building, you're dealing with an existing operation in that building, and that increases the cost a ton because you have to deal with dust, you have to deal with equipment and how to deal with the mechanical equipment that's already operating and how to keep it running. And so from a cost perspective, the best thing to do is if you're going to build the maximum amount that you want to build and then keep those spaces unfinished, and you're saving 60, 70, almost 75% of the cost because most of the cost there is on the interior. If you look at, say there's 40 or 30 parts to a building, so exterior, caulk, sheetrock, carpet, everything that has to come as part of a building, 30% of it is the structure. So everything else is all inside. And that's why you'd be saving a lot of money by doing that.
So maybe another related question this is more of an engineering question, I guess, so I may not know the answer to it. So I know that the current structure has foundation support for 2 stories. So the question now becomes, if we go above that, like 3, 4, or 5, or however, is there a difference in the amount of work that would need to be done if we go for 3 or 4 or 5 from the foundation's point of view?
So the foundation is actually a really big unknown here. Understanding what's there and whether or not it can be used and continued or not, or whether or not it has to be extended, it all depends because the code changed about 2 years ago-ish. There was a massive collapse in Surfside, Florida, and the seismic code changed nationally. So figuring out exactly what's there and figuring out whether or not that's actually going to work to be able to reuse it is one thing. But in addition, regardless of what you do, if you're adding columns, you need to add foundation. So if the building footprint is expanding, then there is foundation work that has to be done. So even if the existing foundation works, there's just still some level of work that has to be done. I don't know the answer to your question. I think as the design gets further developed, that'll be further figured out. I don't want to really provide you an opinion, but typically foundations, like I can tell you, in a lot of the buildings that I've done where we used existing foundation to work, the existing foundation was less than 10 years old. Typically after that 10-year threshold, a lot of things happen to a building settlement and stuff, that when you're adding more to that foundation is then being used in ways it's not used to being used. So then there's additional settlement and differential settlement and stuff like that. So there's a lot of factors that have to be reviewed by the structural engineer before going down that route. And I think right now it's probably a little too early to figure out. And that's why I've been kind of focusing the discussion around the operations being, if we're building on this property, there's an obvious answer, and that was one of the questions here, is can it be built on this property without turning the mesgid off or closing the mesgid for a period of time? And, it's very, very difficult and very costly to do that, to build on top of an existing building that is currently being operationally used. However, there's a lot of options that you can do in order to keep some level of operations going. So you can build put a triple wide trailer across the street, which would be even bigger than this prayer space right now, and use that for prayer space in the meantime, or other options. There's a lot of other options that can be considered, as well as, and it depends on what's happening. So if there is a building going across the street, if the decision is to do something across the street, whether it's a retail store or whatever multi-use facility, I don't know, you can use that space, you can build that space while this building is still being used, and then use that space temporarily as a mesgid space until, there's a lot of different things. So the answer to your question, I don't know. Sorry. Oh, I have one other question here while we're passing the mic around. So another question that was asked, is it fair to say that the total cost of the project is no longer $3.5 million? That's a tough question to answer. So at the end of the day, right now, Sister Maha said 2 limitations. There is a third limitation to those 2, which is the budget. So what is the cost of the job? What is the amount that the organization is willing to pay? And building around that amount is very possible. So if you're talking about a 7-story building and a 4-story parking structure, absolutely, the answer is no. But I don't know that we're talking about that. I don't know that that's the decision that's going to be made. So I'm pretty confident that whatever the decision is made on the budget, that the project will be amended to match that budget, right? So, and that's where we're talking about, well, how do we maximize using the money that we're spending, but not fit out the spaces that aren't needed? And that's a good solution of doing that. And there's other solutions like that, where, you might add a lot of things, and then there's a lot of different things happening. So the answer to that question is also a tough question. I don't know. Go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum. I'm sorry I came late. I have some comments about the rezoning. I know you visited them already. You already are up to date on that. As far as religious organizations are concerned, I think there's no limit to that. It can be placed in any zoning area. That's what I know from my experience. The other aspect is your foundation. The foundation is a floating foundation in this building, which may not support anything at all, but you have to put 3 columns here on either side and 2 columns in the front and the back. That may be the solution to it. There's another aspect of it. My own imagination is, of course, it doesn't matter if it doesn't carry, that this should be a 3-floor building, and on the top you can put a parking on the roof or parking too. But of course that depends upon the cost and what we can afford to do that. Of course, I'm not in any committee here, but at the same time, I'll be happy to present my point of view. I was just thinking the property line could be the walls here and extend it in the front, and there's a very small parking a lot there, which may be for sale, which belongs to the restaurant over here, and you could use for egress also. So there are certain ideas I have. I'll be happy to talk to you later.
Awesome, thank you. So to address the 2 questions that were in there. So the second question you asked about the parking structure being on the roof. So of all the places to put parking, usually the most expensive place is on the roof, because when you put it on the roof, you have to beef up the structure all below that. However, it's also not inexpensive to put it down below. So, there's a cost analysis there that has to be done and figured out. To answer your first question, so I pulled a section of the Knoxville Code because I had a feeling this question was going to come up. So you can see here, if I'm still sharing my screen. Okay, so the places of worship, that last line in the spreadsheet, and you might not be able to see it as well, but the last line on that spreadsheet there is places of worship, and there's an S or a P. A P is a permitted use, meaning if you're in that zone, you can get a use without having to do anything. You can get a place of worship without having to do anything, you just request a permit, which they can't really deny because it's permitted use. An S is a special use approval. And a special use approval is required when you go in front of the planning commission, and then they grant you that special use approval. You have to give them a reason and all that stuff. Which currently, and to answer the sister's question earlier, currently we do not have a special use approval for this property yet. It's something we're obviously going to take care of. And it's something that's probably grandfathered in, so it's not like we're going to have a huge issue, but I wanted to mention that. Of all the zonings, so there are seven zoning types that do not allow a place of worship. So those zoning types are industrial mixed use, industrial RD, IG, IH, OS, NA, and USS. But regardless, those zoning types don't permit them, but you can go against something that's not permitted by going in front of BZA, which is the Board of Zoning Appeals. So I guess to answer your question, yes, there is a way to do it in all of them. However, a place of worship for the ones that we're talking about here, essentially, which are CG, is a permitted use, so we wouldn't even need a special use approval. And then the RN zonings, which are the zoning across the street, is only allowed under a special use approval, so you would have to get a special use approval through the city, through the planning commission in order to get that. That's essentially, so in addition to that, also on this thing, I cut it and pasted the parking lot and parking structure allowances. So you can see the top two rows underneath that gray is parking lot and then parking structure respectively. Parking lots are only allowed in 4 zoning types, and parking structures are only allowed in 8 zoning types. So there are very, very strict limitations to what can be done, and this all went into our discussion as far as figuring out what the best solution was and what to discuss and stuff like that. We have about 10 minutes, so if you guys have any other questions, feel free to send them in or bring them up. Oh, sorry.
What size restrictions do we have based on the parking? Is it just the main congregational area, or is it the building as a whole?
Okay, so parking and what's the maximum size, I think was the question of if you were to build a parking structure, how big could it be?
No. Like, if we just had a parking lot there, the 80 or 90 spaces there, what constrictions on the building?
Yeah,
Like
okay.
3,000 square feet, is
I
that
got it.
just for the main area? Or the
How
whole
big of a building can we build based on the limitation of parking? Okay, so if you look at the bottom of this slide, basically right now, if we were to go with just a parking lot, the largest amount of parking spaces that I think we could fit is 90 spaces. And that's based on doing a lot of stuff that I was talking about before with the retaining walls, etc. 90 spaces gets you 360 people without an exclusion request. You can submit an exclusion request to extend that, and that brings you to 432 people. And that's based on 7 square feet per person, which is the standing room only limitation issued by the code. So 432 people gives you 3,024 square feet. That's only in the assembly space. So the way that the code works, they only limit you in a place of worship from a size perspective and from a parking calculation based on the place of assembly or the main prayer space. So in a church, it's the church hall. In a masjid, it's the musalla area. So essentially, we could build a building that has 3,024 square feet of total musalla space, and then you can extend to that and add other uses in the building without having to add more parking, because at the end of the day, the concept is that everybody that's in the building is going to come down to the prayer area during prayer, and that's the biggest congregation. So that's the minimum parking limitations that they have. There is a maximum parking. So say you were to say, all right, let's build a parking structure across the street and make it as big as possible. Well, there's a maximum size to the parking that you're allowed. So you're not allowed more than, I can't actually remember it, but I think, I can't remember it, so I'm not going to speculate on it. But there is a maximum size to the parking. So you wouldn't be able to build, in this case, I think it was around 800, if I remember the numbers correctly. But so I guess 1 space every 2 people or something instead of every 4 people. But you can only build the structure based on what's there, except if you go to an industrial mixed use, which is a zoning that allows for a parking structure. If you go to a zoning that allows for a parking structure, then you're not building parking for a specific use. You're building parking to build parking. So now you're limited by the maximum limitations of the structure, which in this case would be under industrial mixed use would be 50-foot building height, and then certain setbacks. I think it's a 15-foot rear setback, and then a set 25-foot build-to zone, etc. So that's kind of the it's like a bunch of temperature gauges, right? And you're turning every one of them to the right dimension and figuring out what's the best solution. I hope that answers your
So if we
question.
filled this spot here, the whole entire, there a rough estimate of what the Masola space would be, and then how many parking spots we would need?
So you would not be allowed to build more than 3,024 square feet of Masala space, but you can still build a 70-foot building. So building height would be maximum, lot size would be maximum. You're building a structure, the entire subject to an approval for a permit, but you're allowed to build a full building within the full constraints of that box right there or shape, as long as the Masala spaces are limited to that square footage based on parking. Now, there's a lot of things, so that they might 7-story building and say, well, that doesn't make any sense, we're not going to let you do that. But right now, if you go to the letter of the book, the letter of the code, this is allowed. So it would just be a discussion of, well, why isn't it allowed? And then they say, well, now you're going to have more than 3,024 square feet of people. So, and then, you go back and forth, and that's where you can negotiate some of that stuff during the process. And a lot of it has to do with what the neighbors allow. So if the neighbors are all in support of the project and they love us as neighbors and they say we're good neighbors, it's a lot less likely you'll get abrasive responses. And when this goes in front of the city planning commission and when it goes in front of the city council, we're going to make it very public to everybody here to make sure that there's a lot of physical support, voter support, because that also sways their decision.
I don't remember right now what the square footage of this musalla is, but we've been counting the past few Jummahs about what the attendance has been, and it's been consistently around 400 total between the men and women in the musalla or in the masjid on Jummah. And that's, the men typically are out throughout the activity area. So just to give you an idea, is if we want to accommodate in one musalla the worshipers we currently have, we should plan for at least 400 people in the musalla. Do you know what the size of this musalla is? I have it written down somewhere, but I don't have it right now.
You can assume it's pretty close though to that number, but because every standing prayer person needs about 5 or 6 square feet, so it should be close.
One of the things we have here is we are in the city. And in the city, there's a street parking, which is also counted towards it. So it's not just limited to your own property, but it is around you, you have the parking from the city. So I think as far as that question is concerned, we probably satisfied pretty good. I think that if we make 3-story occupied, closed space, that will be fine because the use will be mainly in the main floor. The other 2 will be.
That's exactly right. And the city, I didn't add that parking into this calculation, but that is definitely the contingency above this. So you are absolutely allowed to count a certain number of spaces in each area. And the amount of space that we have here, we would take some pictures on days that nobody's at the masjid and show how much available street parking there is on typical days in order to help promote that discussion and get more than what the city currently allows as far as street parking, because it's just an unused area. Especially back here, if you look down the street underneath this bridge here, it's barely ever occupied, so you can also account for a lot of that too. So there's definitely more that can be done. This is the bare minimum based on just the 2 properties we have.
Yeah, one of the great area, some positive thing for us is also all these people around us, they are not permanent resident. They are transient population, and they will likely not opposed.
Yeah, and that's a very good benefit of having this historic Fort Sanders neighborhood nearby, is that while the HOA president, or the neighborhood district president, I think his name is Stanton Webster, he remains and is here. The majority of the population in his neighborhood are not permanent residents. They are rental residents, and they come and go. So that's a huge benefit that we have when we go to have these discussions with them, with the city as well. Okay, another question we have was how many parking spots we have now. So currently across the street, there is 72, I think. I counted this morning and I said it earlier, but I forgot the number. But it was around 70, 75. And I think you have about 10 up there and maybe 4 or 5 down here. 6? Yeah, back here, sorry. So overall about 80, 85 spaces maybe. And then plus the the street parking and stuff that's available. How many people it would allow you? So you can multiply it by 4. So 280, about 300 people. I don't know what the current occupancy is of this building legally, but based on that size, let's see. Yeah, so that would mean that if everything is by code, the prayer areas in this area are around 2,000 square feet. Yeah, so that's definitely an option among the many thousands of options. So,
Problem is the parking across the street is not officially legally counted by the city because it's not been beneficial. So we would have to make that change, inshallah. We're gonna have to stop soon because there's Quran classes that take place in the masjid. We would like to hear people's opinions. So when we stop, we can informally gather outside in the activity area. Please fill out the survey if you haven't already, and send it to other people to fill out. And then even once this meeting is done, because I'm sure people we've heard lots of questions, but not as many opinions, and so feel free. We can just maybe be out in the activity area for a little bit. You guys can let us know. People online, I think you know how to reach us primarily, but fill out the survey if you haven't already, inshallah. And then, Brother Hamid, any final things that you want to say?
No, I really appreciate. Sorry, go ahead. Okay, so the request is that maybe the next event is, instead of at 10 a.m., to be put it surrounded around one of the prayers, and I think that's a great idea. So we'll definitely keep that in mind. I got another question here before I give my last words. So do we know if there are other construction projects in the area that could affect the city council and how they may see our potential project? So typically the city council does not really take into account other construction projects in the area negatively. The only time that they do is when it affects parking. So just something to keep in mind, otherwise it's not really a big issue. And then as far as the final comments, I really just, invite everybody to please fill out the survey, send out the survey. We're constantly looking at it. We're constantly reviewing it. As I said, just from sitting here, there has been 2 additional responses to the survey. So now we're at 72 responses, which is great. But please keep that going. Please keep sharing the survey, and inshallah, we look forward to moving into the next step here, which is the most exciting step in my opinion, which begins going down the line of draft plans and different layouts and stuff like that, so we can start discussing what the logistics and the circulation of the masjid is.
Just going to go ahead and finish up, inshallah. Imam Khalid is not here to finish us up with the dua, so I'll just very briefly give a dua. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalam ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi sallam. Ya Allah, please guide us to what is best, what is pleasing to you, what is best for our community. Give us ease, give us clarity, and unite our community under the banner of Islam and in a cause that is pleasing to you. Sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi sallam. Thank you all.